On a world map, there is a giant bite mark right in the middle of the North American continent. It's not a volcano. It's not a valley. It's not a desert. It is an inland sea that freezes over completely every winter, something that, in theory, should not exist where it does. And the question isn't why it freezes. The real question is, how can a frozen sea in the middle of a continent dictate the entire destiny of a nation, deciding where people live, how they trade, and even becoming the cradle of the largest commercial empire in human history? This is the story of Hudson Bay. And no one can understand Canada without understanding this peculiar sea. Take a close look at a map of Canada. The country is nearly 10 million square kilometers. It is the second largest area on the globe, second only to Russia, a territory stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the United States border all the way up to the Arctic. But right in the center of all that vastness, a void. A huge oval-shaped sea carved deep into the middle of the continent like an unhealed wound. This is Hudson Bay, with an area of over 1.2 million square kilometers, located in northeastern Canada, surrounded by the provinces of Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec, to the south, and the territory of Nunavut to the north. To the east, it connects to the Atlantic Ocean via the Hudson Strait. To the north, it opens into the Arctic Ocean through the Foxay Basin. To understand its true scale, you could take the entire US state of Texas, throw it into Hudson Bay, and still have room to fit the entire state of California. It's an inland sea, a real sea. But this is where things start to get strange. Most major seas on Earth have one thing in common: they are deep. The Atlantic Ocean has an average depth of over 3,300 meters. The Pacific Ocean has trenches that go down to 11,000 meters. These oceans are massive basins, underwater canyons that humans have never fully explored. Hudson Bay is different. Its average depth is only 100 meters. Its deepest point is less than 270 meters. If you were to compare the Pacific Ocean to a standard swimming pool, Hudson Bay would be just a puddle after a rainstorm. Why is a sea covering over 1.2 million square kilometers so shallow? The answer lies in something that disappeared 10,000 years ago. But its consequences remain to this day. During the last ice age, this entire region was buried under the Laurentide ice sheet. A colossal ice mass, kilometers thick, so heavy that it didn't just cover the land, but actually depressed the Earth's crust, like someone sitting on a spring mattress. The continental crust was compressed by hundreds of meters, creating a giant bowl that sank deep into the Earth. When the ice melted, seawater flooded in to fill that bowl, and Hudson Bay was born. But here's the truly astonishing thing. That bowl has not finished rising yet. Right now, the Earth's crust beneath Hudson Bay is slowly rebounding like a spring after being compressed for 10,000 years. This geological process is called isostatic rebound, and it's happening at a rate of about 1.3 centimeters per year. The coastline is slowly rising. The bay is slowly shrinking. In other words, Hudson Bay is gradually disappearing from the map, just very, very slowly. But its shallowness isn't the only peculiar feature of Hudson Bay. Take a sample of water from the Atlantic Ocean and a sample from Hudson Bay and bring them to a laboratory. The results will surprise you. The water in Hudson Bay is significantly less salty than normal ocean water. The reason is that Hudson Bay is not just a sea, it's also the drainage point for a massive basin that spans across central North America. More than 40 major rivers flow into the bay every day, including the Churchill, Nelson, and Severn rivers, and dozens of other tributaries from the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. Even from the states of Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota in the United States, south of the border. The total area of the drainage basin flowing into Hudson Bay is up to 3.86 million square kilometers, nearly 1/3 of Canada's total area. Every day, billions of litres of fresh water pour into the bay from these rivers. But because the bay is almost completely enclosed, only connecting to the ocean through narrow straits. The fresh water has no way to escape quickly enough. It accumulates, diluting the salt water, creating an unusually low salt concentration for a sea of its size. And it is this very dilution, fresh, shallow, cold water that leads to what makes everything truly dangerous. Fresh water freezes faster than salt water. At 0 degrees Celsius, fresh water freezes, while normal seawater remains liquid down to about negative 1.8 degrees Celsius. It may sound small, but over a sea of more than 1.2 million square kilometres, with an average depth of only 100 metres, that difference is enormous. Every winter, Hudson Bay freezes completely. Not partially, not mostly, entirely. Over 1.2 million square kilometres of surface water transforms into a vast, flat sheet of ice, connecting with the surrounding tundra. It becomes an ice highway for polar bears to travel and hunt. The average January temperature in this region drops to negative 29 degrees Celsius. Fierce blizzards sweep through during December and January. And the cold air isn't just cold. It's the kind of cold that can kill an improperly equipped person in just a few hours. Come summer, the ice melts completely. The water opens up, and then winter returns, and the entire cycle repeats. This freeze cycle on such a massive scale is almost unprecedented for a sea at this latitude. And this is what surprises most people. A portion of Hudson Bay is at the same latitude as London, England. Let that sink in. London, at 51 degrees north latitude, has mild, damp winters where temperatures rarely drop below minus 10 degrees. Stockholm in Sweden, at 59 degrees north latitude, has an average annual temperature of positive 8 degrees Celsius. But Churchill, the small town on the western shore of Hudson Bay at 59 degrees north latitude, has an average annual temperature of minus 6 degrees Celsius. Same latitude, completely different. That staggering disparity is not accidental. It has a specific geographical cause, and to understand that cause, you have to understand what scientists call the weather machine. In most places around the world, large bodies of water act as giant thermostats for the surrounding land. They absorb heat in the summer and release it in the winter, creating a temperate climate for coastal regions. That's why coastal cities in Europe are comfortably habitable despite being at extremely high latitudes. Hudson Bay doesn't do that. Because the bay freezes over completely in winter, it completely loses its ability to regulate temperature. When cold air masses from the Arctic sweep southward, what is known as the polar vortex, they don't pass over a warm ocean. They slide across 1.2 million square kilometres of flat, uninterrupted ice and snow, losing none of their temperature, and even gaining speed. Hudson Bay transforms into a giant funnel, channeling the Arctic climate much deeper into the continent than it would normally reach. The permafrost line, the boundary below which the ground remains frozen year-round, is pushed much farther south than in regions of the same latitude in Europe or Russia. The result? A vast region in central Canada, and millions of square kilometres in size, rich in minerals and watered by hundreds of rivers, becomes a place where long-term modern human settlement is nearly impossible. Large-scale agriculture is impossible. Urban development is extremely difficult and expensive. Infrastructure is constantly destroyed by the seasonal thawing and freezing of ice. And this is where Canada's greatest geographical paradox begins to emerge. Canada is the second largest country in the world, but if you look at a population density map, you'll see something incredibly strange. Nearly 90% of Canada's 40 million people live in a narrow band along the southern border with the United States, within about 160 kilometres of the border. 90%. The entire vast north, millions of square kilometres of boreal forest, tundra, rivers, lakes and mineral deposits is virtually empty. On a map, Canada looks like a territorial superpower. But in reality, Canada's truly inhabited land is as thin as a thread along its southern edge. More like Chile in South America than a true continental nation. And Hudson Bay is the main culprit. The bay isn't just literally cold. It also creates a massive geographical void right in the middle of the continent. Surrounding it is the Canadian Shield, one of the oldest and hardest rock formations on Earth, unfavourable for agriculture, with almost no fertile soil. It is also fragmented by countless lakes, swamps, and waterlogged peatlands. The frigid climate created by the bay blankets all that land in ice and snow for nearly half the year. In a country that is theoretically immense, in reality, only a narrow strip of land is habitable by modern standards. And that narrow strip exists precisely because it is far enough south to escape the influence of Hudson Bay. Geography has dictated where Canada is allowed to exist. But in this story, Hudson Bay is not just a destroyer, it is also a creator. And to understand that role, you need to go back in time to one of the most insane periods in the history of human exploration. Imagine you are a European sailor in the year 1610. It was an era when Europe was obsessed with a dream, finding the Northwest Passage, a sea route through North America to shorten the journey to Asia, where spices were more valuable than gold. Henry Hudson, an English sailor, was the next to try his luck in that search. He commanded the ship Discovery through a treacherous, ice-filled strait and suddenly entered a seemingly endless expanse of open water. Hudson was convinced he had found the Pacific Ocean. He was wrong. He had just entered the greatest trap in maritime history, an inland sea whose icy walls would close in around his ship when winter arrived, trapping him and his crew for months in unimaginably harsh conditions. When winter came that year, the ice closed in. The ship Discovery was trapped in the ice. The crew survived in huts on the shore, battling scurvy, starvation, and the bitter cold. When spring finally arrived and the ice melted, Hudson wanted to continue exploring, but his crew did not. One of the most famous mutinies in maritime history took place. The crew seized Hudson, setting him, his teenage son, and 7 loyal sailors adrift in a small open boat. They then abandoned them in the middle of the icy bay and returned to England. Henry Hudson was never seen again. His name was given to the bay that killed him. And the story doesn't end there. You would think that after such a tragedy, Europeans would stay away from this place. But geography has a way of forcing people to return, just with different objectives. A few decades after Hudson's death, Europe was gripped by an unlikely fashion craze: beaver fur hats. Not gold, not spices, beaver hats. In the 17th century, hats made from felted beaver fur were the ultimate status symbol in Europe. From aristocrats to merchants, everyone wanted one. The demand was insatiable, and Europe had long since exhausted its own supply of beavers. But Canada had not. The frozen forests around Hudson Bay were prime beaver territory. Their pelts were thicker and more luxurious than anywhere else on Earth, precisely because the harsh, cold climate forced them to grow the densest possible fur to survive. The French already controlled the fur trade in Canada, but their supply chain was a logistical nightmare. To get furs from the interior to the Atlantic port cities, the French had to canoe for thousands of kilometers through the Great Lakes and complex river systems, navigating countless portages. Each shipment took months and was incredibly risky. Then 2 French explorers named Radisson and Groseilliers looked at a map and realized something everyone else had missed. Hudson Bay sits at the heart of a massive drainage basin. Nearly every major river in central Canada flows into it. If you could sail an ocean-going ship directly into Hudson Bay, bypassing the entire overland journey, you could drop anchor right at the mouths of those rivers, trade directly with the Cree and other indigenous peoples who were bringing furs down the rivers, and then immediately sail back to Europe. It wasn't a trade route, it was a geographical cheat code. When the King of France rejected their idea, Radisson and Groseilliers took it to England. King Charles II immediately recognized the geographical power of the proposal. In 1670, he signed a royal charter. It didn't just grant them permission to trade, it granted them ownership. King Charles II's Charter of 1670 created the Hudson's Bay Company, and with it gave the company a trade monopoly over the entire Hudson Bay drainage basin. This territory was named Rupert's Land, area, 1.5 million square kilometres, more than a third of the area of modern Canada, stretching deep into what is now the United States, including large parts of Minnesota and North Dakota. With the stroke of a pen, the King of England had given a private corporation a territory larger than all of Western Europe combined. The Hudson's Bay Company didn't just trade. It operated like a de facto government. It issued its own currency. It drafted its own laws. It built fortified trading forts at the mouths of strategic rivers flowing into the bay. York Factory, Fort Churchill, Fort Albany. They were like the outpost cities of an empire with no king, only shareholders. The Cree, the Inuit, and other indigenous peoples played an indispensable role in this empire. They were the ones who truly knew how to navigate the frozen terrain, how to hunt and prepare the furs. The Cree in particular became crucial middlemen, acquiring furs from tribes deeper in the interior and bringing them to the Hudson's Bay Company trading posts. A complex and efficient distribution system was built not by Europeans, but by the very people who had lived there for millennia. This was no accident. The Cree and Inuit didn't just adapt to the Hudson Bay climate, they weaponized the cold. In the summer, they kayaked on open water to hunt beluga whales and seals. When winter came and the entire bay froze over, they used dog sleds to travel hundreds of kilometers across the ice. A speed and efficiency that no contemporary European vehicle could match. The wall of ice that Europeans saw as an obstacle was a highway for these people, and the trading empire built on that understanding endured for centuries. The Hudson's Bay Company still exists today as a major retail chain in Canada, making it the oldest continuously operating corporation in the English-speaking world. But the story of Hudson Bay doesn't end in the past. Between 1682 and 1713, France and England fought directly on the waters of Hudson Bay for control of the trading forts. Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, a French naval commander, led numerous seaborne attacks on the forts of the Hudson's Bay Company, winning and losing control of York Factory multiple times. These were not minor skirmishes. These were direct conflicts between two European empires, and their battlefield was a frozen sea at the edge of the world. Ultimately, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 ceded the entire bay to the British, and from then on, the Hudson's Bay Company solidified its unshakable position. But here is something few people know. When Canada became an independent nation in 1867, and when Rupert's Land was transferred to the Canadian government in 1870, the country's political map was essentially a copy of the commercial decisions the Hudson's Bay Company had made 200 years earlier based on the bay's geography. In other words, Hudson Bay didn't just create a trading company, it shaped the borders of an entire nation. And yet, and this is the greatest paradox, the very sea that created Canada is also what prevents Canada from developing its core. Look again at the narrow 160-kilometre strip along the US-Canada border. That is where Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, and Ottawa exist. That is where 90% of the Canadian economy is generated. It is where 90% of Canadians live, work, and call home. North of that strip, millions of square kilometres of land are virtually empty. Not because there are no resources. The resources there are incredibly abundant. The rivers flowing into Hudson Bay hold some of the world's greatest hydroelectric potential. In Quebec and Manitoba, massive hydroelectric dams have been built on the rivers that flow toward the bay. The Le Grand complex in Quebec is one of the largest hydroelectric projects on the planet. It supplies power not only to Montreal and Winnipeg, but also exports surplus electricity to the northeastern United States each year. Beneath the frozen ground around the bay's shores lie enormous mineral deposits: nickel, copper, zinc, and even diamonds. Not metaphorical diamonds, real diamonds. The Canadian Shield surrounding the bay is one of the most diamond-rich regions in the world, and there are industrial diamond mines here. But extracting those resources in such an extreme climate is an unimaginable technical and financial challenge. There are no year-round roads. There is no stable infrastructure on the permafrost. Every dollar earned from mining here costs many times more than at any mine in a temperate climate. The geography of Hudson Bay created wealth, but placed it in a lockbox made of ice. But the world is changing. And that change is shaking the geographical rules that Canada has lived by for centuries. Global temperatures are rising, and the Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. Hudson Bay, which was once a solid block of ice in winter, is witnessing a distinct change in its freezing cycle. The ice forms later in the fall, it melts earlier in the spring, the annual open water period is getting longer each year, and that is opening a geopolitical door that the world is not fully prepared to face. The port of Churchill, in the province of Manitoba, is Canada's only deep water Arctic port. Located on the western shore of Hudson Bay, this port has historically operated seasonally, open only a few months each year when the ice thaws enough for ships to pass. From here, grain from Canada's Central Plains is exported on the shortest route to Europe. If Hudson Bay continues to warm, Churchill could become one of the most important ports in the world, a maritime shortcut connecting the heart of North America with Europe and Asia without passing through the Panama Canal or the Strait of Malacca. An Arctic bridge. That's what transportation strategists call this prospect. And Canada, with its unique geographical position, could be the nation that benefits the most. But there is also another side to that warming that few want to talk about. As Hudson Bay warms, its extremely fragile ecosystem is under threat. Churchill is famously known as the polar bear capital of the world. Every fall, about 1,000 polar bears gather near Churchill, waiting for the bay to freeze so they can go out and hunt seals on the ice. This is the species' basic survival condition. If the ice freezes later, even by just a few weeks, the polar bears don't have enough time to build up the fat reserves they need for the winter. Along with them are approximately 55,000 beluga whales, making up nearly 28% of the world's total beluga population. They migrate to Hudson Bay each summer to give birth and molt. The bay's ecosystem supports one of the largest beluga whale populations on the planet. If that ecosystem is disrupted, there is no guarantee this population can be sustained. Hudson Bay is the quintessential example of a 21st century geographical paradox. The same climate change that is opening up economic opportunities is also threatening to destroy an ecosystem. What Canada chooses to do with Hudson Bay in the coming decades will not just be an economic issue, it will be the answer to a deeper question about national identity. What does Canada want to become when the ice that has defined it for centuries begins to melt? There is something few people notice when looking at a map of Canada. The names of most of the large northern provinces and territories, Nunavut, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, do not originate from French or English. They come from indigenous languages. Nunavut in Inuktitut means our land. Manitoba is believed to originate from Cree, referring to the strait where the Great Spirit dwells. Indigenous peoples have long understood this. Hudson Bay is not an enemy. It is the centre. It is a source of life, a travel route, a food pantry, and a weather system, all in one. They learn to live with it, not against it. And it is that philosophy of using geography instead of fighting it that gives rise to all the stories in this passage. Radisson and Groseliers read the map and saw opportunity instead of an obstacle. King Charles II saw geography instead of territory. The Cree saw an ice highway instead of a deadly sea. And Hudson Bay, through all those perspectives, wrote the history of a nation. Let's return to the original question. How could a frozen sea in the middle of a continent dictate the entire destiny of a nation? The answer is not simple. Hudson Bay did it by being something unclassifiable. It is not a sea in the conventional sense because it is too shallow and not salty enough. It is not land because water still flows into it from all directions. It is not an ocean because it freezes over completely each winter. It is not a lake because the salt water remains. It is all of those things at once. And it was this geographical ambiguity that created a chain of consequences no one could have predicted. From determining where an indigenous people could live and travel, to shaping the fur trade routes, to redrawing the political map of North America, to pushing 40 million Canadians south toward the United States border. Canada is not a country designed by humans. It is a country created by geography. And Hudson Bay is the silent architect behind it all. A shallow, cold sea slowly disappearing. And it has changed the world forever. Sometimes what looks like an empty space on a map is the heart of everything.